Hello and welcome to today's live stream with the Third Testament Foundation. I found some text about what is justice. Like really, if you ask these Socratic answering and questioning like what is truth and so forth. If we really ask what is justice and try to find out what justice is. And so I'm going to read this little bit of text, sections 1246 to 1256. Before that, let me just kind of explain how Martinez explains this justice concept. Like we see, we have different beings here in the edge. All these white circles represent living beings with an eye, in which the white, and then we have the so that's the eternal part, and then there's the manifest world. And we see the planet here, the six colors. So we see how the planet is in this evolutionary spiral going towards the star. We see how these beings are at different evolutionary levels, and actually what Martinez is trying to explain with why we shouldn't judge anyone or why nobody's actually a criminal, and that's because like if we see like in the animal kingdom, if we have a monkey, you shouldn't blame a monkey for being a monkey. A monkey does what it does. That's its nature. So we don't lock up monkeys because they do what monkeys do and call them criminals. But of course we can protect ourselves from monkeys, right? Likewise, if we have some beings here in evolution that are more evolved than beings here, of course, if the laws of society is made is natural for the beings here, but not here, so all of a sudden these beings are doing something criminal just by being themselves. So, and that's the kind of point that Martinez is trying to make in the text, that, for example, here we see the different evolutionary steps. If you're here in the happy marriages zone and you're somebody else is up here in the zone of infertility, you do not blame those in the happy marriages zone for being happy in a marriage. That's just their evolutionary stage, or the step they're on in evolution right now. So, so that's the kind of thing we gotta keep in mind when we read the text today. And all the symbols, of course, are copyright Martinez Institute. If you have any questions, you can text in or leave a message on a voicemail. If you have any topics you would like to have covered in these live streams, you can also email or just leave a voicemail, text it in here. It's 1941 462 3177. So let's just dive into the text, and first we'll read a little abstract of what we're gonna read. It's kind of the headlines of the chapters or the sections that I chose to read here today. Society must learn to understand that so-called criminals are not really criminals, but younger brothers in evolution. Why it is easy and natural for society's respectable citizens to conform to its statutory laws, while it is difficult for criminals. How the judgment with which we judge others constitutes the judgment with which we ourselves will be judged. Why he who is without sin does not judge anyone. Why cosmic analyses are necessary. The beings for whom the cosmic analyses are necessary. The being for whom the cosmic analyses are not necessary. In any society, there will always be beings that will punish, chastise, or take revenge, as long as it is necessary, regardless of how many beings exist that no longer can take part in any form of punishment or revenge. And lastly, beings that today are in need of the future's view of justice. Why being a pioneer in the new cultural epoch is not without pain. So that's the kind of tone, that subject we're gonna read about. So let's dive in and see what Martina says about it. So, what is society to do about amoral beings or criminals? Society must first and foremost learn to understand that criminals are neither criminals nor amoral beings, but are completely normal expressions of the steps on the ladder of evolution that they represent or to which they belong. Just as every law-abiding and highly esteemed citizen within the state is an expression of the steps on the ladder of evolution that he or she represents. The only difference is that the ladder represents the step or place on the ladder of evolution occupied by the state itself. The state step is the citizen's mental home. It is thus entirely a matter of course for him or her to be one with the state's leading moral views, the more so as it was precisely beings from their step who created the laws of the state. It is quite another matter in the case of all the beings that do not yet find themselves on this step, but who are nevertheless born within the physical boundaries of this state and are therefore subject to its statutory laws or established social order. Since the step of the state is above the evolutionary step of these beings, they will find it increasingly difficult to have the same view of morality and justice as that represented by the laws of the state, since they are organically and thereby mentally bound to the view of morality and justice that holds true on their own step. Since they thus belong to quite another level of consciousness, a level at which their faculty for experiencing imposes on them a correspondingly different view of life and way of being from the view dictated by the faculty for experiencing possessed by beings that conform to the step of society. This means that these younger souls in evolution must violate their own concept of justice, their own innate moral view, if they are to conform to the laws of society and avoid society's revenge or punishment and being branded as criminals. It goes, of course, without saying that life is very difficult for such young souls, beings that are on the same evolutionary step as that of society itself, and for whom the laws of society express precisely what they themselves perceive as justice, can of course easily be law-abiding and thereby decent, respectable, good citizens. All they have to do is to live their own lives, follow their own innate tendencies, which correspond exactly to compliance with authorized morality. They have an innate antipathy towards exactly the same phenomena as those forbidden by this state. If these beings, younger brothers in evolution and in society on the other hand, likewise live their own lives according to what they consider to be moral and just, they will, as previously mentioned, be punished for their way of living. They must therefore struggle with all their might to conform to something that others call morality, justice, and honesty, but which is entirely contrary to their own view, since they, of course, can accept from the bottom of their hearts only knowledge that conforms to their own view of morality or justice. The words of Christ on the cross, "They know not what they do," here emerge as scientific truth. It also emerges here as a fact that punishment of and revenge on these beings cannot be the same as true justice. To punish a being for something he does not know must surely be at least as great a crime as the crime for which he is punished. So the words of Christ, "For with what judgment ye judge, ye shall be judged," likewise emerge here as scientific truth. He who punishes a being, whether it be with an unkind word or the infliction or direct bodily suffering, renders himself guilty of manifesting exactly the same principle as the principle that he and the state judge and punish criminals for. If his younger brothers on the ladder of evolution are criminals because they act according to their own concept of justice, then both the state and the law-abiding citizens are also criminals. They too act according to their concept of justice. Any form of judgment of other beings as criminals is thus an absolute judgment of the judge's own being. His judgment reveals completely what he understands and what he does not understand. It shows fully his own moral standard. Since criminals in the absolute sense cannot exist, anyone who judges another being as such will, with this judgment, commit an injustice towards the other being. He brands him as something he's not. And through his judgment, the judger reveals that he is guilty of the same infringement of the law as the infringement with which he brands other beings as criminals. In truth, only he that is without sin can cast the first stone. But he who is without sin does not countenance stoning anyone. He who is without sin can be nothing other than he who understands, and he who understands sees of course that no one can be more perfect than he is today. No one can be as perfect today as he will be tomorrow or in the future, regardless of whether he is stoned or punished in some other way or not. But he is more perfect than he was in the past. His place on the ladder of evolution today thus constitutes his fundamental standard of consciousness, which means that the being in no way whatsoever can know or understand anything other than what his sensory faculty, which is based on this standard, gives him access to. He who is without sin, or he who understands, thus sees that the being cannot manifest actions or forms of morality and justice other than those that it is able to build up by means of this sensory faculty. It is not so remarkable that he who is without sin warns us not to judge. That is all very well, but of what use, then, is the analysis presented here about criminals not being criminals, but younger souls in evolution who know not what they do, and the fact that punishing them is unjust? Well, this analysis is of very great use to the being that today is beginning to love its neighbor, beginning to have so great an intellectual talent that he or she can understand the cosmic analysis or science of life, and who very much hates the idea of being party to, for example, sentencing these younger brothers to punishment, prison, or other injurious treatment of body and soul. As long as people do not completely understand their own being, the decisions and views of those in authority on religious as well as purely material matters must of course inevitably be their mental compass or rule of conduct, even though their hearts writhe at the thought of perhaps having to be subject to the authorized judicial and religious paragraphs of these authorities in certain areas. One will have pangs of conscience if one does not comply with or adhere to these paragraphs, just as one will also have pangs of consciousness and be at odds with oneself if one does practice or adhere to them. One's mental attitude can thus be likened to a flickering candle that is suddenly threatened by a dangerous gust of wind from the one side and suddenly by an equally dangerous gust of wind from the other side. If one does not manage to sufficiently protect one's mental state or one's mental light, it can easily lead to one, instead of shining with a clear flame, becoming a candle that can only smoke and reek. One's mental candle can be made to burn only where it is protected by a strong will. But a strong will can exist only where it rests upon an absolutely secure mental foundation. A secure mental foundation can exist absolutely only where one feels that one is in absolute contact with justice. This contact will in turn be able to rest only on either absolute belief or absolute knowledge. Where one does not firmly believe that one's way of acting is just, or does not know for sure that it is just, one can be nothing but an unsteady or swaying reed in the storms of life. This is the point at which one, among other things, cries out to heaven, "What must I do to be saved?" And is it not so today that there are thousands upon thousands of people who do not want to be soldiers, who do not want to be executioners? Indeed, are there not many who cannot even kill animals or eat meat or other coarse animal products because it is contrary to their nature to do so, but are at the same time unhappy because they feel compelled in many cases or to a great extent to go along with it nonetheless because the precepts, judicial and religious paragraphs of the authorities and the opinion and conventions of the flock demand it, and single out anyone who deviates from this as an offender, a criminal, an eccentric, or a downright abnormal being. In order to hold one's own in the face of such opposition, one must of necessity possess a will that is rooted either in an unshakable belief or in correspondingly unshakable knowledge that one's view is neither criminal nor abnormal, but solely just. The mental weight or heaviness that such resistance can be for beings that do not share the opinion of the flock or the general public is, of course, wholly unknown to the beings that still swear by the morality of the flock and its judicial and religious paragraphs. They are supported in happy ignorance by the mass suggestion and force that a majority group, by its very nature, will always exert on a minority group or a single individual. By a being that from a mental point of view feels compelled to stand outside the majority of the flock, a being that may indeed be entirely alone in facing their mass suggestion, has quite another need for a firm belief or absolute knowledge behind its exercise of will, and its way of being must be in quite another way guarded about its own moral point of view and its individual appearance if he or she is not to be suffocated by the embrace of current authorized traditions. And it is for these pioneers of a new cultural epoch and a new step in evolution that the present analyses are necessary. All the beings that have no need of the analysis in the present work can of course be only those that still have not that have still not reached a point in their heart of hearts where they feel the same as the above-mentioned pioneers. They can be simply beings that still want to hate, punish, or take revenge in one form or another, whether it be by means of the current penal code or, indeed, in the worst cases, by means of even eternal damnation for the unwanted neighbor. They are beings that feel that they are in excellent contact with the society, religion, sect, or religious denomination or other flock formation they happen to have joined, or they perhaps even experience a combination of delight in their own self-made, selfish opinions, if any, and for the moment are content with these. It is a foregone conclusion that such beings are quite impervious to the scientific or logical substantiation of unselfishness and the law of neighborly love that the present analyses constitute. And here we have thus a new proof of the fact that even if there are beings that cannot take part in punishing and taking revenge, there will always be enough beings that have the heart and mentality to attend to all the robust measures, the karmic effects or causes that must and shall inevitably occur within a society of beings that still do not love their neighbor as themselves, but in their thoughts, nature, and appearance, more or less uphold or swear by the law of punishment or revenge. How could primitive, hateful, and unloving beings otherwise receive their returning karma and come to reap what they have sown? If such beings were not surrounded by beings of their own type, but were surrounded by nothing but angels and forgiving beings, they would of course never ever come to experience the sufferings of revenge and punishment, nor would they be able to feel happy with the forgiving beings, since they would be able to regard them only as primitive, naive, and cowardly if they did not consider them downright abnormal. And we have here once again an insight into how everything at any given moment is precisely as perfect as it can be. But this does not exclude the fact that in conformity with the same law of perfection, it can and will be more perfect at a later moment, and will thus express what can only be the most perfect at the moment in question. If the structure of society today is such that it takes revenge, punishes, or chastises, then this is the absolute height of perfection, which means it is the height of what society today understands by or can provide in the form of justice. But this naturally does not mean that society at a later point in time will not be able to envision a kind of justice that is even more perfect. As long as society has not gained experiences or insight into the absolute truth behind all the natural laws of life, which in reality means neighborly love, it has of course to stick only to the suppositions or notions that it has been able to form about the laws of life. But gradually, as its experiences accumulate and become science or wisdom in the consciousness of society, this society must of course also change its suppositions about justice in favor of an insight into justice that is far clearer and more elevated than the insight it has today. And this changing of its view of justice must inevitably continue until the laws of life are totally exposed as actual facts. And since they are then no longer mere suppositions but pure truth, its view of justice can no longer be changed. A justice that is based on the laws of life that have been revealed as fact is the very peak of the living being's view and perception of justice. The judicial laws created by society in conformity with this culminating view of justice will of course at that time be quite different to the judicial laws that are based on the view of justice that is accessible to modern society today. That this future view of justice will not be the most perfect one for society today is, of course, only what we have already pointed out. But since it is naturally just as obvious that society's view of justice today is just as imperfect for the society of the future, we will here be able to see that it is of some importance that a certain knowledge of this future's view of justice is generated. It is precisely this view that is beginning to come to the fore in all the beings that today have more or less grown away from being able to take revenge and punish, and therefore begin to feel that they are at odds with society's religious and judicial clauses. Indeed, in many situations, they do not even have the heart to insist on making claims on their neighbor or holding him or her responsible. These being rights or claims that society authorizes. Therefore, choosing to suffer in these situations rather than have their neighbor punished or have inflicted upon him or her the mental or physical unpleasantness, the disgrace, and the branding as a criminal that the state's penal code authorizes. And the last section here, indeed, being among those who are in the forefront when abandoning the old, superstitious, but authorized traditions of the flock, the general public or society and its generally accepted customs and conventions concerning what one ought to believe and think, and what one ought to say and do in this or that situation is not always without pain. But this is not so surprising. It is the pioneers alone who have to build the future mental road for the flock. It is they who must remove the heavy fossils and boulders of superstition and blaze a trail through thousands of years of time-honored traditions, customs, and conventions. It is they who must bear the brunt of the narrow-mindedness of the ignorant flock, and the indignation and evil or unkind criticism, hatred, and persecution ensuing from this. But, thanks to the fact that the most outstanding of these beings are at one with the divine will or the plan for the future of the flock or the general public, and thanks to their being completely independent of the narrow-mindedness and persecution of other beings engendered by this, they guide the flock steadily and safely over all obstacles, forward and upwards towards the sunlit peaks from where, now at one with the Father, they have complete overview of the panorama of life and the kingdom of heaven, where they are at one with eternity, infinity, and omnipotence. And with these words, I say thank you for today, and hope to see you on the next live stream. Make sure to text any questions if you have, or leave a voicemail, anything. Stay in contact, and see you soon.